And I'm a speech therapist as well. So it does give me, when I say immense pleasure to introduce Saskia this evening, I mean it in every possible way as a peer. So just by way of introduction, warm welcome to the CPD session. And this topic, like I said, it's one that sits right at the heart for me of gender affirming care, voice and communication. So voice and communication for me is very central to how people are recognized, understood, and affirmed in everyday interactions. For me, they shape how we are heard and how we are read by others and how we recognize ourselves. So this evening's session promises to be both clinically rich and deeply human. Our session is titled Voice and Communication Therapy Across the Gender Spectrum. And like I said, it's my real pleasure to introduce our speaker, Saskia Lilienfeld, who uses they, she pronouns. Saskia is a Cape Town-based speech language therapist and activist whose work is grounded in person-centered affirming care. Saskia is a UCT graduate. They have practiced in both South Africa and the UK and previously led the speech therapy department at Khayelitsha Hospital, a role that speaks to their commitment to public accessible care. In 2021, Saskia established a private practice focused on gender affirming and neurodiversity affirming voice and communication therapy, offering services nationally through online care. Alongside their work, Saskia is an active advocate for trans communities and affirming healthcare. So what makes Saskia's contribution especially valuable is the way they bring together professional expertise and lived experience. As a non-binary person diagnosed with ADHD in adulthood, to create space for clients to explore voice, identity, and communication in ways that align with their sense of self. Saskia, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mershon. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. And it is such a pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. Thank you for joining us in this dark, cold evening. So, like Mershon said, I'm going to be talking about voice and communication therapy, or rather, gender-affirming voice and communication therapy across the gender spectrum. Ooh, hold on. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to start off just talking about what gender-affirming voice and communication therapy is. So it is a non-surgical speech and language therapist-led process where we work to modify vocal and communication characteristics to align with gender identity. So helping an individual find their true or their authentic voice. Many people are not able to develop their true authentic voice as they grow up due to a binary world and societal expectations. And this journey aims to place that individual back on that journey of discovery. So we aim through the therapy process to help individuals feel at home in their voice and their communication style. And this means often, but not always, creating new and safe and sustainable habits around pitch, resonance, intonation, articulation, volitional sounds, which are things like coughing, laughing, clearing the throat, communication style, and nonverbal communication. And I will be going into more detail with each of these things a little bit later. Gender-affirming voice therapy aims to reduce or even better, when possible, eliminate voice dysphoria and to affirm the identity of an individual, build their confidence, and help them to unmask and connect with others as their true selves. For many of the people that I do this therapy with, they have not, up until now, they've often felt like they have to hold back or they withdraw because they aren't comfortable with the way their voice sounds and their communication style. And that means that when they connect with people, either they choose not to, or when they do, it doesn't feel authentic or it doesn't feel real. So through this process, we aim to help people, take that mask off and build more connections that feel affirming to who they are and true to them. And gender-affirming voice and communication therapy falls under the broader umbrella of gender-affirming care. So who are the people who are seeking gender-affirming voice therapy? The answer is anyone who feels that their voice or their communication style does not match their identity. And often these are our gender diverse people. So often it is the trans masc, trans femme, non-binary, agender individuals, or people who identify somewhere else on the gender spectrum. And the reason for that is because these individuals were often not able to safely and freely discover their own voice as they grew up, due to, again, the societal expectations and the binary norms that are forced upon them either directly or indirectly. However, cis people also often seek gender-affirming voice therapy, and this is because they often also seek greater alignment between their voice and how they communicate and their sense of self. So just to give you some examples for that, for example, I've seen a cis woman who felt like her voice, people didn't take her seriously. She felt like her voice sounded very girlish, and that didn't match who she was. And she wanted to sound more confident. She wanted to sound like a woman, and like that is 100% gender affirming voice therapy. On the other side, if I think of like a cis man that I've worked with, one example that comes to mind is someone who feel like they sometimes, well, their messages, they what they intended to communicate in like a gentle way, and like the gentleness that they held within them was not communicated. So people often took things that they said almost like aggressively. It didn't land the way it was intended. And again, just finding kind of like that gentler communication style is for that individual also very much gender affirming voice therapy or communication therapy. All right. So this is important. Who decides who needs gender affirming voice therapy? It is the individual. It is always the individual who identifies the mismatch. It's not the clinician, any clinician. It's not the family, and it's not society. Not all gender diverse people want voice therapy or need voice therapy. The therapy does not exist to make other people comfortable. It does also not need to result in a binary voice unless that is what the individual wants. And if the individual is happy with their voice, then that's perfect, full stop. We would want, ideally, for society to adapt and for people to be accepted no matter what their voice is, or however their voice does or doesn't match what society expects it to sound like. Very important with gender affirming voice therapy is that the client is the expert on themselves. The voice therapy journey is one of exploration. The therapist provides the space and the skills to play with the voice and explore the different elements of the voice to help to create the space where the client can find their true voice. But it's the client that knows what aligns with them, what feels good, what doesn't feel good. And that guides our voice journey, you know, what brings that feeling of like euphoria for them. That is the guide. All right. Then why do people seek gender affirming voice therapy? One of the big reasons, obviously, is voice dysphoria. And this is a sense of distress or discomfort when the voice and communication style do not match that individual's identity. The voice is uniquely exposed because unlike a name or your appearance that you can, you know, control kind of before, or you can have a name that affirms and aligns with your identity, and you might be able to change your appearance to match your identity, but your voice happens in real time. And I've had many clients who, for example, are terrified of, you know, public bathrooms. They're terrified they accidentally clear their throat or they cough or something in a public bathroom where they will be exposed and they might face risk of discrimination or aggression. Or, you know, another client that the other day was telling me, as young trans femme woman, people often come up to her in like clubs or something, and if they try to speak to her and she answers back, they kind of like back away, and it's quite like a frightening experience. So again, the voice as I said, it is uniquely exposed, and many people also will be gendered correctly until they speak. And then someone who has been gendering them correctly will be like, oh, sorry, and switch pronouns around. And that is also very dysphoric for individuals who do experience voice dysphoria, because again, not everyone experiences voice dysphoria. So yes, the voice can affect how people feel in their own body, how and if they connect with others, and how safely they move through the world. And with the therapy, we aim to seek greater alignment, confidence, and authenticity. And with that, hopefully, the voice dysphoria is reduced and ideally, if possible, eliminated. Then another big reason for the voice therapy is what I also just touched on, is safety. So sadly, we do not live in a perfect world. And many of my clients actually are completely comfortable with their voices as they are. But they still come for voice therapy. And the reason for that is safety. Their voice, like we said, can out someone, expose them to discrimination, put them at risk. And I think this is a very important distinction, that for some people, the need for the voice therapy is not personal, it's social. For other people, sometimes it's both. All right. So then I just want to add a note here on masculinizing voice and testosterone. So historically, masculinizing voice therapy has been largely overlooked, and the focus has mainly been on feminizing voice therapy. Also, actually, like neutralizing voice, or kind of creating a kind of androgynous voice, that's also kind of been often quite overlooked. And the reason for this, especially for the masculinizing therapy, is that people, or it's been assumed that testosterone will do the job for the voice when we want to masculinize. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware, not everyone wants to take testosterone, and not everyone is able to take testosterone. The testosterone, and I'll get into a little bit more of the details of this later, but testosterone only affects the pitch of the voice. And pitch is one component. It does not have any effect on any of the other components of the voice. So while many people who do take testosterone are completely affirmed by the effects and completely satisfied by the pitch changes alone, that is not true for everyone. And there is so much more that we can do to help, well, anyone, whether it's feminizing, masculinizing, or neutralizing. There's so much more that we can do beyond pitch to facilitate the discovery of the true and the authentic voice. And I will talk about that very shortly. But that brings us to the fact that the voice is highly flexible. And like I said, there's huge amounts that we can do. And I've kind of been focusing up to now a lot on the typical kind of gender mask fem styles of therapy. But many people, if we think, for example, also including now like the cis community and gender diverse community, many people also seek therapy to sound more confident, more assertive, have a smoother voice, maybe a less nasal voice. So the goals are as individual as a person. While our voice is shaped partly by our individual physiology, a huge proportion of our voice and our communication style is based by habit. And while habits are tough to change, they absolutely can change. And that's ultimately actually what the affirming voice and communication therapy is. It's becoming aware of your habits, your current habits, and then finding the new habits that you want to incorporate, and then making those habitual. So for many people, the voice that they have today was shaped by suppression rather than free exploration. And that is exactly why change is possible. Again, in a perfect world where children and young people would be free to explore their voice and their identity without judgment or interruption, they would already have created the habits that align with them, most likely. So again, in a perfect world, gender-affirming voice therapy would be much less necessary, much less needed. However, that being said, even in a perfect world, people's identity is fluid. So people change, identities can change or evolve over time. So a voice that might once have felt true to someone might no longer feel that way. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the components of the voice. When people think about the voice from a gender perspective, for most people, the thing that comes to mind is the pitch of the voice. So people associate higher pitches with feminine voices and lower pitches with masculine voices. However, if you look at the studies and literature that's been done on voice, you would see that there's actually a really big overlap between the average masculine, feminine, and neutral or androgynous pitches. And you might have heard a voice that is like higher pitched, but you can tell it's a masculine voice, or you might have heard a deeper, lower pitched voice that you can tell it's a femme voice. So what all of this shows us is that pitch, again, it's just one part of a much bigger picture. And arguably, it's one of the less important ones. And if we think back to the testosterone example, many people, but not everyone who do take testosterone do not completely feel like it's done everything they want for their voice. For many it has, but for many it has not. And that would be because the other components of the voice have not changed. So with our pitch, the pitch is a result of the vocal cords vibrating. When the vibrations are fast, we get a higher pitch. When it's slow, we get a deeper pitch. And again, with testosterone or like going through male puberty, the vocal cords thicken and become heavier, so the vibrations slow down, and that's why we get a lower pitch. We can think of those vibrations of the vocal cords as the primary vibration, because there's also a secondary vibration. That secondary vibration is how the sound waves that emit from the vocal cords vibrate through the body, in particular the cavities of the body. So that would be the space of the lungs, the airway, the throat, the oral cavity, the nasal cavity. So the way that the sound vibrates through these cavities, that is our second component, that is resonance. Now, there are different habits between resonance habits for the typical masc, femme, and gender-neutral voice. So masc habits or masc resonance habits, the resonance or those vibrations are focused more in the chest, whereas kind of more gender-neutral resonance habits would be focused more on like the neck or the throat, and femme style would be the head, particularly the oral cavity, and aimed forwards towards the lips. And what this does, what resonance does, is it gives the voice a quality. So that masculine chest resonance, there's different ways that we can describe it, but some helpful ways of describing it would be the masculine resonance is like a richer or like a darker sound. If you were going to consider it to be a color, it would be like a rich winter color, like a chocolate brown or like a maroon. Whereas the femme resonance in the mouth would be like a bright color, like a bright yellow or a bright green or pink. And that is a much brighter sound quality. It's like a cleaner sound versus the masc, which is actually can also be described as like rumbly versus like a clean femme sound. And then the gender neutral, like if you have, I'm sure everyone here has heard like a voice that they would consider kind of androgynous, that would be somewhere in the middle. So it's not quite that rumbliness, but it's also not quite that brightness. It's on a spectrum also, so it's not, the way I explain these things and how I'm going to be explaining the rest of it, I'm often making them sound quite concrete, but all of these things exist on spectrums, and we also still all have our individual physiology, which also affects the way our voice sounds. But often the things like, like a resonance, like where we resonate, that is a habit that we've built over time, and we can change that. So if we're feminizing, we can bring resonance up. If we're masculinizing, we can bring it down. If we're neutralizing, depending on where it already is, we can move it kind of to the middle. Sorry, I just want to quickly go back to pitch, because something I forgot to mention was that even though pitch is not this like the big the whole picture thing, it absolutely still is something that we can work on in the gender affirming process. So if we are masculinizing with or without testosterone, we can bring lower pitch. If we're feminizing, we can raise pitch. And there's actually something called our habitual pitch. Our habitual pitch is where we start every new utterance, usually. And it's called habitual for a reason. It's because it's a habit, right? So we can change it as well. Sorry, just back to where I was. So I was talking about resonance, and I'm now going to move on to the next component, which is intonation. And intonation is how we add like expression or emotion to our utterances. Now, again, I'm kind of simplifying it a bit for the sake of this presentation, but just in simple terms, there are two main components to intonation that both masc and fem voices use. And that is an increase or a bounce in volume and a bounce or increase in pitch. So both masc fem voices use both, but the feminine voice uses the pitch component much more, and the masc voice uses the volume component much more. If we were going to go for like a gender neutral, it would be somewhere in between these two pictures. So just to demonstrate what I mean here, so this kind of bluish green color, that's pitch. In the fem style, it would be a big intonation pitch bounce. So if I took the sentence, that was amazing, and I want to emphasize the word amazing, the fem way would be, that was amazing, right? Where I'm bouncing up in pitch quite significantly. And there might be a volume component, but it's mainly pitch that you can hear. And then the masc style would be inverted, and it would be more of a volume component, less of a pitch component, even though both exist. So the masc version would be, that was amazing, versus that was amazing, right? Okay. Okay, then the next component is articulation. So articulation, this is how we pronounce or articulate like our words, our syllables, etc. Now, to explain this, I'm going to borrow some musical terms. So in music, we have the terms staccato and legato. In music, staccato means the musical notes are each separate and distinct from each other. So you can imagine, like, if you go up the keys of a piano, each note is its own distinct note. Whereas legato is where the notes blend into each other. So if you imagine like the scales of a violin, they all kind of bleed or blend into each other. So the masculine articulation style is more of a staccato style, which is like the piano. And the fem articulation style is more like the legato, like the violin. So if we look at the fem one first, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if you see like the M blends the first syllable and the second syllable, and the Z blends the second and the third syllable, so it becomes amazing. The syllables blend, whereas the masc style is amazing, amazing. The M only occurs in the one syllable, not both. It's not a may, it's a may. Right, then when we look at things like volitional sounds, like the cough, the throat clear, the laugh, all of these use voice. So again, we can adjust pitch to match whatever the target pitch is that we're working on. And we can adjust things like resonance. We can even add, if we're feminizing, for example, we can add one of these pitch bounces if it's appropriate. So for example, with the throat clear, if you go, right, you can hear that pitch bounce, which is a much more feminine sound, where the masc would be a flatter one, like coughing is quite similar as well, and then laughing, I'm not gonna go on a tunnel with that, but with laughing, we brighten the sound quite a lot if we're feminizing, and we make the sound darker if we're masculinizing, and that's again comes back to resonance. Okay, communication style. So by this, I'm referring to kind of things like choice of words, directness, descriptiveness. There are words that that femme communicators are much more likely to use. There are words that mask communicators are much more likely to use. Also, mask communicators tend to be a lot more direct and to the point, whereas femme communicators will often add things like, don't you think so, or isn't it? So often, yeah, but femme communicators can be described as really trying to make space for other perspectives or opinions and things, and not trying to step on toes, whereas mass communicators are often much more to the point and much more direct. Also, femme communicators are much more likely to use descriptive words in normal day-to-day communication. Again, masculine communicators are more direct. So I know that I haven't been speaking too much about the kind of neutralizing, but if I'm describing the mask and the femme, think of it as a spectrum, and then the gender neutral, like there isn't like a formula for any of these things actually, but the gender neutral would kind of be somewhere in the middle, and the individual can explore and see which elements they want to take from where, or where they want to kind of fit in that spectrum with guidance. Oops, sorry. Then nonverbal communication, that would be things like body language, gesture, facial expression. So for example, mask communicators, when listening, are much more likely to lean back and listen, whereas femme communicators are more likely to lean in. With gesture, masculine communicators usually gesture away from the body and make bigger movements and more kind of angled movements, whereas femme communicators usually have gestures closer to the body, more like fluid movements, and closer to the body and towards the body. And then with facial expressions, femme communicators are much more likely to smile and make longer eye contact than masculine communicators. And again, all of this that I'm describing, like there isn't a right or a wrong way. And I am making it sound quite concrete. But again, all these things exist on spectrums, and how these spectrums interact with each other can really create like a unique voice that again is built on the foundation of the individual. It's not about like copying someone else's voice or a generic voice. And there is no right or wrong way. And especially if we think about, things like what I spoke about now, like the nonverbal communication, if we are thinking about like our neurodiverse population, things like smiling or whatever, like something someone wants to explore. And again, like I said, it's the client is the expert. They decide what feels good for them and what they want to explore. And then even if they explore something, they might decide, actually, this isn't for me. All right. Okay, so the therapy process. We start with an assessment, we move on to goal setting, we explore the voice, various components that I mentioned, we play around with them, we practice, and then we start incorporating it into the real world. And we do this one component at a time. So, for example, if pitch is one of the things we're working on, we will start with pitch. And then when they're very comfortable with the target pitch that we're working on, we will integrate resonance with the pitch. And once they can do kind of complex interactions with the pitch and resonance integrated, that's when we add the next level, which would be usually intonation and etc. And we follow a hierarchical approach. So we start simple and then we build up the complexity. So we might just start with humming, then we move on to single syllable words, multisyllabic words, phrases, sentence level conversation, etc. Then cognitive load is also an important thing to take note of here, because someone might be able to have a conversation about something simple like the weather, but if they are a lawyer and they need to, defend a client in court, that's a much different level of cognitive load, right? So the higher the cognitive load is, the more difficult it will be for that individual to keep their voice consistent. And the things that affect cognitive load is the complexity of what the individual is talking about, the complexity of whatever they're involved in at the time. So if, for example, someone is busy cooking and following a complex recipe while having a chat, that's going to add to the cognitive load, because they are focusing also on what's going on or what they're doing or the environment. And then the third thing is emotion. So someone might be keeping their voice fairly consistent, and then suddenly they get a fright, or someone drives in front of them in traffic and they shout out frustration. Like emotion also has a big impact on cognitive load and on consistency. So we take like that hierarchical approach, we build up the complexity slowly over time. And when we do start practicing in like real world scenarios, we usually start with short, simple, kind of low stakes interactions. So for example, someone might know they're going to go to the shop later and they know they're going to need a shopping bag. They can practice before the time asking for that bag, and then try it in that real life scenario. And then that guides them, either it goes really well and then they know we can maybe, try something else or do something a bit more complex, or it doesn't go quite the way they want. And then that feeds them information on what needs more work, what needs more practice. And we try to reframe these moments because they can be quite dysphoric, obviously. We try to reframe them without taking away from how they can make someone feel, but as something which is also like almost as something that can also be positive, because it's almost like road signs pointing them away from what they don't want and towards where they do want to go. So it's really like information rich experiences, even when it doesn't go exactly the way you want it to. And then lots of people might practice with family or friends or a partner if it feels safe and comfortable. Unfortunately, not everyone has someone like that they feel safe practicing with. And with this hierarchical approach, we also often go like, what's the next step that's challenging but accessible? And then you slowly move forward like that. Like, okay, we've achieved this. What's the next thing that feels, it will challenge you, but it doesn't feel impossible. It feels within reach, and slowly move forward like that at a pace, again, that the client sets, because they're the expert, they're in charge. All right, so like I said, the components exist on spectrums. It's not as concrete as my explanation suggests. There's no right or wrong way. Client is the expert. We aim to be playful, explore, non-judgmental. I've been speaking quite a bit about like when we are young, we can explore and play, with the way we use our voice and move our bodies in a way where we're just playing and we're not judging ourselves. We're just figuring out what feels good. And that is what we kind of want to reconnect with in this therapy process. The true voice is already inside them. We're building on their own foundations. We're not constructing something new or copying someone else's voice. We're exploring within them and finding what's already there. A note on accent. So I often get asked, like, if someone comes and sees me for therapy, are they going to have my accent? And the answer is no. We are, like, I'm providing a space where we can explore the voice. They're not copying my voice. They're actually playing around with their own voice and finding what aligns with their identity. So it really isn't about copying someone else's voice or my voice or anyone else's voice. It's about exploring their own voice and building on their own foundations. All right, so just a quick note on safety and vocal health. So the voice, while it is incredibly flexible, it is also delicate and it can be damaged or injured. So while much can be done to adapt the voice, how to do so safely is not always intuitive. And it's really important for people to learn how to implement changes while they keep their vocal muscles relaxed. And often when people are kind of groping and they're not quite sure how to do something, they overcompensate with tension. And tension for the voice results in strain and can eventually lead to injury. So as a very important foundational part of the therapy, we need to facilitate an understanding of the voice, how it works, what safe and sustainable habits feel like versus what tense, non-sustainable habits feel like. And we often also work on things like posture, how like diaphragmatic breathing or how the individual breathes, and the breath support for the voice, because the voice is powered by the breath. So all of these things are quite interlinked, and when posture is off or breathing is shallow, that can add extra tension to the voice area, and that can, if that is something someone needs to do to reach the pitch or whatever the quality that they want for their voice, that can become a habit, and over time it can cause damage, or it can hurt the voice. So many people who train via sources like YouTube videos, unfortunately, do develop unsustainable vocal habits, either short-term or long-term, and usually both. So they might find that like they can keep their voice for like 5 minutes, but then they start feeling pain or strain. Or maybe it's more of an accumulative thing over time, but it is usually both. Also, sources like YouTube frequently do not facilitate tools like vocal exploration. It's often more of like a copying. And this often results in feeling inauthentic, or people find that they like hit a roadblock and they can't quite get to where they want to be. The voice therapy process without guidance is quite complicated. And especially without tailored guidance and not being able to ask questions, it can, yeah, it can result in basically work that needs to later be undone, or kind of like, especially if someone's been putting a lot of work into their voice and now they've built these habits that they've worked really hard on, but these habits are hurting them. It's really unfortunate for them when we need to actually take a step back and undo some of that work again. Also, training sources like with YouTube, they often don't balance the components of the voice. So this is not my description, but what some of my clients have described as like a cartoony effect. So that might be, for example, with feminizing, if someone raises their pitch, but they haven't balanced resonance out with that, then we can get kind of like a cartoony sounding voice. Then, like we said, it can result in vocal pathology. So that might be something like vocal nodules or vocal polyps, which result in a rougher voice quality. In addition to now having a vocal pathology, that rougher voice quality can be particularly dysphoric for those seeking to feminize their voice, because that the rougher voice quality can quite contradict what you're able to do to feminize the voice, and a rougher voice is more associated like with the masculine voice. All right. So I also want to just speak about the emotional landscape. So while the process of the voice therapy journey can be deeply affirming and empowering, it can also be very vulnerable. The voice is deeply tied to identity, memory, and a sense of self. And for many, the old vocal habits or communication habits that they have were created for safety. So therefore, the unmasking can initially feel scary and weird, even when it's something that ultimately they want. So I just want to check how I'm doing on time. Not so good. Okay, so I won't go on a side note there. Changes can bring up unexpected emotions. So it could bring up relief or grief, embarrassment, euphoria, and the therapy room needs to be a safe container for all of that. The goal of the therapy is not just in finding the authentic or true voice, but it's also supporting the person through the process and whatever it might bring up for them. Especially if you think about the fact that these people have developed a voice that's not their true voice to keep them safe. When you start dismantling that, the brain sends out like alarm bells. And one of the that inner voice that is trying to keep them safe can say like really harsh, mean things. So one of the parts to the therapy, when or if that happens, is also getting them to understand that that voice is it's coming from a good place, in the sense that it's been trying to protect them their whole life. Maybe it's not working for them anymore. It's out of date and it's maybe misguided, but it's really it's really working hard to try to keep them safe. And we can approach it with gentleness and empathy and tell the voice, like, it's okay. I can see you really care about keeping me safe, but I've got this from here. You can have a much needed rest. So personally, I incorporate acceptance and commitment principles in my therapy process. So helping clients connect to their values, approach the process with openness and self-compassion, and loosen the grip of unhelpful self-stories. And then ideally, the therapy should also be trauma-informed. So gentle, paced, and client-led and transparent. All right. And then lastly, just I was thinking just of ending this talk with some client experiences. I was thinking of some of the clients I've seen in the last little while. And the one client that came to mind, she's in her mid-30s, trans woman. We actually already wrapped up therapy now, but in the last couple of sessions we had together, she had been like fully using her voice in all components of her life and her world. And one of the things she said to me in the session is, I have so much to say now. And another great quote was, I have arrived. She said conversations she wouldn't have felt able to have before, she is now having in her work, in her personal life, and her relationships. And for the first time, people are receiving her and her communication messages as she intended them to be received. Then another client that came to mind is a young, early 20s trans woman as well. And she, until recently, would almost not, well, she would leave the house, but only if her mom was with her. And in restaurants and places, she would whisper to her mom like what she wanted to order. And now we've also gotten to the phase of the therapy where she is using her voice more and more. And she recently went away on a weekend with friends. She's building new connections. She's ordering her own drinks and food and things in restaurants. And one of the things that she said is, my world has opened up. Then a trans mass client, I have late 20s. He's always been very nervous of having interactions with cis men, even when he's wanted to connect with them. And he was telling me that I think someone he saw at gym or something that he really wanted to connect with. And the one day, when he felt confident enough in where he was with his voice, he started engaging and they had a chat and he ended up recommending a book to this guy. And just before he'd come to see me for a session, he'd said that the guy had texted him about the book and they'd had a conversation about it. And he was feeling like very euphoric about that. And then the last one I just included because I thought it was quite funny. A trans woman in her 30s was laughing hysterically, saying I sound like my mother, but she meant it in like a very happy and euphoric, in a good way. All right, so I think I'm only 2 minutes over. If anyone has any thoughts or questions or anything, I would love to hear them.
Saskia, thank you. I think that was really rich. I'm sure everybody would agree with me in saying that there's so much information there that was beautiful to listen to. I mean, you raised lots of issues, health issues and the toll on mental health when voice and identity are not aligned, things like the barriers to affirming healthcare and the very real risks that your clients carry. I think it's a powerful reminder of why this work matters, both clinically and ethically. So I'm sure there's questions in the room, so let's open it up. Please pop your questions in the chat or raise a hand, or we'll just take them as they come. I'm sure there's lots of interesting comments or questions. Anything are welcome. Maybe while we're waiting, I can start the conversation. As you're talking through, especially those last few case studies, I think for me it's interesting always sharing how you initially work with people. So when you approach the clients that you work with, what do those early sessions look like? And how do you get that initial picture of their voice goals and the sense of self in practice?
So my initial session with a client, my assessment session, I usually book them for like quite a long session. So it's usually somewhere between 75 to 90 minutes. And I get like, it's a lot of giving them the space and the room to explain like what brought them here, there's no right or wrong answer, but like what do you want from this process? And also, I usually will give them kind of a similar spiel to what I gave now about like what's possible. So they come in kind of knowing what we are working with, and then we talk about what of those things I spoke about, what feels important, what maybe doesn't feel important, and I also aim to get kind of not just, it's not just a voice assessment, because I will do things like check what their current habitual pitch is, look at kind of their resonance habits, intonation. But it's beyond that. I also want kind of a bigger, broader picture of what their life looks like. What are their support structures like? What is their what does their gender journey look like so far? Because having this kind of bigger picture information, again, just helps me to understand them better and to facilitate through the process, like anything that it might bring up for them, anything. And as we do this, like this is a bit more later on in the journey, but often we need to practice voice. So we'll also just be talking, having conversations if we get to a conversational level. So often I'm also learning more about them in that journey. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And then,
that gender
sorry.
landscape.
And then as we start doing the actual therapy part, like we're starting to look at pitch or resonance, etc., it is like I was saying in the talk, it's very much how they experience it, and that guides us to, what to keep working on or what next try next.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I see we've got a couple of hands up, so without delaying.
I actually have a client that I just started seeing who is a gay cis man, and he feels like his voice is not truly his because he's always kind of tried to be like fit the idea of what he should be or what society wants him to be. So now he's kind of coming in and exploring, what would be more him. But the qualities you mentioned, like vocal fry, like those are absolutely things that we can identify and we can work on in therapy. It would be with vocal fry, it would be also looking at the breath and the breath support for the voice, because it happens when there isn't enough breath supporting your voice. So there are techniques and things for all of these. With the intonation at the end, like yes, often with femme voices, people, okay, this is a whole nother talk, but the femme voice developed in a way like where you don't want to upset someone or step on their toes, because that could, put you at risk. And so often the femme voice will say something like as a question instead of as a statement, because in case you don't agree, I don't want to offend you, So whereas the masculine voice is very much more like, again, I'm speaking big generalizations here, but it's usually much more to the point. So those are absolutely things that we can work with, and that kind of falls under communication style and also kind of connects with intonation. But yeah, it is so rich. There's so much here that we can work with, but it's, again, these are habits. So once we can identify that it's something that doesn't work for you, you start becoming more aware of it, because the first step to doing any of these changes is becoming aware of what you're currently doing, what your current habits are. And once you become aware of them, then we can start modifying them.
Thanks
I hope that
very much.
answers.
And I think that opens up a lot of thinking around, besides looking at the way we practice essentialism and think about gender through those lenses in our framework in our work, but also thinking through broader cultural accent issues. So there's lots to think around that and how we work as therapists in that space.
Okay, so again, I've spoke a lot about habits, right? The longer you've had a habit, the more difficult it becomes to, because that's what our habits are. They're really established neurological pathways. And when we form new habits, we form new neurological pathways. And we want those to become the established ones, the ones that our GPS sends us down automatically. So the younger we are when we start this, the easier it is to adapt those habits. It's also possible for, I have people who are not young and who are we can start in like when they're young, and the thing with the voice therapy is it doesn't have to be permanent. It's not like the changes have to be forever, because we can, if we, and I've actually got two clients at the moment where they were identifying as trans masc, and now they're like, actually I'm connected much more with my feminine side and I don't want my voice to sound as masculine anymore. And those, like, we can go back to it does take work. It isn't just like overnight. It takes commitment, but we can go back. It's not permanent. It's not surgical, it's habit based.
does open up that classic question I think speech therapists for a long time have been facing, is when is it early enough to do any of the work that we do with any population? And our usual answer is it's when you start communicating, which is literally from day zero. So there's all kinds of things that people need
And
to think about communication broadly. Sorry,
it's
Saskia.
often, sorry, interruption. There's often
No,
also,
no.
I'll hear of, like, I'll start seeing like a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old who are finally coming to me after like 2 years of refusing to go to school or, refusing to speak to anyone except for people like direct family members. And when we get to that point, like this child has suffered so much. We can start earlier and we can allow them to build those connections and feel safe. So I think especially if their world starts shrinking because they are holding themselves back, then that's a really good indication that like something needs to change. So it's a good question. And the thing with feminizing voice surgery is, again, all it does is affect pitch. It doesn't affect your resonance. It doesn't affect your intonation. It doesn't affect any of the other habits around voice. So while it can lift your pitch high and it can actually make it quite significantly high, and it's a difficult process because your vocal anatomy has changed very suddenly. So it's kind of like going through puberty in reverse, but like much, much bigger changes. So you almost, it's like trying to play guitar, but you can't find the strings. Sometimes, it actually takes quite a lot of therapy after. No, I guess maybe it's not true for everyone, but in my experience, to get someone to actually just understand and connect with their voice again. And then again, all that it's changed is pitch. So I'm not saying that there isn't a place for vocal feminization therapy, surgery at all, but we can do a lot of this pitch work without surgery. Like the voice is incredibly flexible, and again, it might take some work, but like the pitch, if I use the term pitch window to describe the pitch that people have access to, we can open up someone's pitch window significantly, and we don't need to do that surgically. Uh, the other thing with surgery is it comes with quite a lot of risks because you are operating on like a really delicate, refined area with lots of like cranial nerves and things. There can be catastrophic results, like you can lose your ability to swallow if something goes wrong. Like from again, I'm speaking as a speech therapist, but I'm not saying that it should never happen, but I think people often think like it's a quick solution. And most people who have it often come to therapy anyway for the same amount of time as they would have if they didn't, because now they've got to get used to their new physiology and they realize that the pitch change is not in itself not enough. And many plastic surgeons, or sorry, or ENTs or whoever do the surgery, many of them won't do it until if the person hasn't already had voice therapy, and that must kind of have failed for them to consider it.
And I think that's a beautiful point to end on. Is looking at the options that people have and how we explore them when we're looking at voice therapy and just and communication at large. Saskia, thank you. That was a beautiful and very thoughtful presentation. Lots of thinking that you've got our brains ticking into. I think for me, you've definitely reminded us that affirming care isn't a technique we apply to clients, but it's a space we create with them. And it's one that they can explore who they are and how they want to be heard. So thank you for your sharing your expertise and for your honesty of bringing your experience into this work. Really grateful that you've done this presentation tonight. So thank you very much.